So there's still some measure of capitalism in this model, in this economic system, isn't there? I mean, again, it has capitalism right in the term. So how can capitalists be against this? Once again, folks, state capitalism is an oxymoron. It is impossible for a market to run efficiently under the thumb of bureaucracy. Private interests run by individual humans with private motives and unique talents, and with a nose for a bargain and a keen eye trained constantly on the bottom line, that is the essence of Adam Smith's invisible hand concept, his notion of capitalism. Now, how does having state control of that in any way resemble capitalism? This is, quite honestly, state capitalism, quite honestly, is what used to be referred to as fascism. Let me repeat that. Benito Mussolini in Italy began the notion of fascista, fascism. And that term has been so abused over the years that now when someone on the right opposes gay marriage, or opposes abortion, or opposes tax increases, or opposes government spending on a myriad of social programs, they are called a fascist. Now, fascism, folks, is private ownership of what Marx called the means of production with heavy government controls, to the point where the decisions that are made in running that private business that is technically, on paper, privately owned, the day-to-day operational decisions regarding that company are handed down by fiat, bureaucratic whim, or legislative force. They are dictated by government. That is fascism. That is not this cutesy little term of state capitalism. And again, Howard Dean, the former DNC chair, former governor of Vermont, and presidential candidate in 2008, made popular this notion of state capitalism. Again, talking about, well, it's not a question of whether we're going to have capitalism or socialism. It's a question of what level of each are we going to have. What's the final mixture going to look like? Is it going to be 2 parts capitalism to 3 parts state control? Or is it going to be half and half? Or, what's the final mixture going to look like before we blend it all together and cap it off with this cutesy little term of state capitalism? And he called it a new kind of capitalism. Well, folks, once you change capitalism from the notion that Adam Smith posited in The Wealth of Nations, and further in the theory of moral sentiment, once you deviate from that definition of what capitalism is, it's no longer capitalism, is it? You're no longer talking about the same proposition. You're no longer talking about the same economic system. You have changed it. And once again, changing the very basis of what you are talking about, changing the very nature of the topic at hand, is what the progressives do. It's what they have done for over a century. Anyway, so just wanted to throw that out there. Again, if anyone has a question, topic idea, etc., go for it. Type it in on Facebook or Twitter or in the chat room here on Spreaker, and I will run with it. Let me see. Trying to go through my notes here, see what else I have going on. Well, again, a lot has happened since last time I was on the air, and actually last time I was on the air was only a week or two after the election. So there's still a lot of things that I haven't covered since the election, and I will get into them momentarily. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was this fiscal cliff notion. Isn't it interesting? I don't know if I've mentioned it on the show since the election, but this whole thing about the fiscal cliff. Oh, we're going to go over the fiscal cliff. If the Republicans don't cave on a debt ceiling deal, then we're going to go over the fiscal cliff. Oh, if something's not done about the Bush tax cuts, quote unquote. You can't see me here. I'm doing the little fingers for quotations. If something's not done about the Bush tax cuts, they're going to expire at the end of the year, and we're going to go over this fiscal cliff. My big question on this, folks, I've been thinking about this since the term first popped up. How interesting is it that every single news broadcast that we have heard since, about the time General Petraeus stepped down as the head of the CIA, citing this affair. How funny is it that every single news broadcast since then has had some mention of the fiscal cliff? Is that not interesting? Every single, even the top of the hour news break on your radio station, whatever station you happen to be listening to, whether it's music radio, talk radio, whatever, every news broadcast has some mention of the fiscal cliff. But it only started around a week and a half after the election. Isn't that just weird? Isn't it weird that a week and a half after this major presidential election, all of a sudden, oh my God, in a month and a half, we're facing going over the fiscal cliff? We had no idea up until this point that such problems were looming for our nation, that our nation was in such dire distress that we would term it a cliff. We had no clue whatsoever. Your members of the media, whose job it is, whose sole job it is to report to the American people what is happening in their country. These valued members of the media, these astute observers of Washington, D.C., had no clue that there was any such crisis looming until a week and a half after the election. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my recollection. If you remember it differently, please let me know. But honestly, sit back, ask yourself, and rack your memory, rack your brains, run through your long-term memory circuits, and see if you can remember the term fiscal cliff being mentioned anywhere on any news outlet, no matter how big or small, or any blog site for that matter, see if you can remember that particular phrase, fiscal cliff, being mentioned any time before November 6th. Very strange. So now we have the Bush tax cuts, quote unquote, getting ready to expire. Folks, if you have had a tax rate, a stable tax rate, for 12 years in some cases, 10 years in other cases, if you have had a tax rate that has been unchanged, completely and utterly unchanged for a decade or more, do you term that a tax cut, or is it simply the status quo tax rate? Think about it. When Ronald Reagan in the 1980s hammered out a deal between the Republican Senate and the Democrat Congress, when he hammered out the deal to lower the tax rates, or consolidate tax rates, I should say, from, I think it was 6 different tax rates at the time, or 8 different tax rates, consolidated it into 4 different tax brackets. And this was seen as a huge, major accomplishment. And what was that compromise deal called by the media when it was passed and signed by Reagan? Well, they were called the Reagan tax cuts, right? And then, when George H.W. Bush came into office, making his big pledge, read my lips, no new taxes, blah, 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 and taxes were raised, they called that the Bush tax hikes. Why? Well, because the rates were changed from what they were under Reagan in the mid-'80s to what they became under George H.W. Bush in, the late 80s, early 90s. They were changed from one rate to another, and that was called a tax hike. When the rates change, the moment the rates change, you can call that either a tax cut or a tax hike, or a tax raise, whichever terminology you prefer, when it occurs. But a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, according to the IRS, when you fill out your form to pay your taxes on April 15th, what does your Schedule 1040 or whichever of the myriad forms you use when you file your taxes, what does that form call your tax bracket? Does it say, well, your Bush tax cut bracket is such and such? No. It just calls it your tax bracket. This is the rate that you pay, because this is your amount of income. It is not considered by the Internal Revenue Service, and hence the Treasury Department, which is under the executive branch of the federal government. It doesn't call it a tax cut or a tax raise. It calls it a tax rate, because that's what it is. again, the twisting around of the language and who is opposing it. Who is standing up to